But yeah, thanks for everyone who's just joining us. Betty, Steve, and I were just having a little bit of a conversation beforehand, and already I'm excited about this webinar today. I think there's going to be lots of great energy and some great content as well. So welcome everyone. My name is Amy Carruthers, and I'm the Program Development Manager at Ag-West Bio. I'm pleased to be joining you all today from beautiful Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis here in a bit of a rainy Saskatoon, but we're happy for it nonetheless. So thanks for joining us today. This is our 5th webinar in the Essentials for Business Excellence webinar series, which is co-hosted by ourselves here at Ag-West Bio, and then FEAD, the Female Entrepreneurs in Agri-Food Development, which we have Kendra here joining us as well. So this is really a free series for agri-food and bioscience startups, and we've covered different business topics that we think are important for startups in our ecosystem here in Saskatchewan and across Canada. So I just wanted to mention quick, Ag-West Bio is a membership-based organization. We work to promote and support our member organizations while offering educational opportunities like this one. And then we also have an investment fund for bioscience and agri-food startups who are moving innovation to commercialization. And so we're very grateful to partner with FEAD as well. And FEAD works to support growth for women shaping and shaking the agri-food industry. They offer accessible and relevant resources, learning, and networking opportunities. So we'd like to get to know you guys all a little bit better. Toby's going to be launching a poll here, so you'll see that come up on your screen. Just let us know where you're joining from and what kind of company you work for. And a few housekeeping rules. So we'll ask you to just keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. And if you have technical troubles, Toby has the handle AWB Events. So feel free to direct message her and she'll help with any technical issues you're facing. Steve and I chatted about it and he's really happy to take questions throughout. But to simplify it, I think we're just going to ask you to ask your questions during the webinar in the chat function, and then he'll be able to see and pick and choose as he's going which ones he can answer. And then anything he doesn't answer, he'll address afterwards in the Q&A. And in the Q&A session, we welcome you to turn on your cameras and speak that way when you have questions. And yeah, I think that's kind of everything. Oh, I did want to announce too that so Steve's going to be coming back here. Ag-West Bio, we're excited to host Steve on December 3rd and 4th to offer a 2-day investment boot camp in December. So Steve will be coming back in person to Saskatoon. For anyone interested in those details and how to register for that investment boot camp, reach out to me and I'll get you details. We'll have more coming out kind of in the summer about that. So now I'd like to introduce Steve, our speaker. So Steve Balaban has over 15 years of experience in the private equity industry as an investor, advisor, and award-winning university lecturer. Steve is the Chief Investment Officer of Mink Capital, Chief Learning Officer of Mink Learning, and an award-winning lecturer at the University of Waterloo, and contributing author to the global CFA program on the subjects of private equity, private debt, and alternative investments. Steve frequently travels throughout North America, Europe, and Asia to teach family offices on how to invest in private equity. Prior to starting Mink Capital, Mink Learning, and teaching at the University of Waterloo, Steve was the Chief Investment Officer at a family office in Canada with a focus on private equity. So welcome, Steve. I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Amy. And thank you to Ag-West Bio and FEAD for having me. You know, it was great to be there. I was there last year for the Investment Readiness Bootcamp, met a lot of fantastic entrepreneurs in Saskatchewan. I think Tyab, who I see just joined, was in that bootcamp. So good to see you there, Tyab, and everybody else. So thanks for coming. So I'm going to take this from the investor perspective, right? That's kind of what I've done. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to give the investment perspective for entrepreneurs. And I'm going to try to mix it into early stage and late stage. And I have lots of slides to show you, but before I go to the slides, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell it to you, and then after we'll conclude it so that you remember it when you leave this webinar. And so we're going to do just a few simple things. We're not with you for so long, so a few simple things. First, we're going to talk about how to pitch investors. After that, we're going to talk about do's and don'ts in private equity, and then after that, we'll do tips for negotiation, whether it's a SAFE, which is an early stage agreement that you can have, a simple agreement for future equity, whether it's a term sheet or whether it's a purchase and sale. Whatever you have, we have some tips for you just in general on how to approach the negotiation. So let me dive a little bit deeper of what I'm about to tell you before I share my screen. So when you pitch investors, there's three things that you need to know before you go to pitch investors. Okay. First, which you all should know, but I just want to make sure you do, is you're going to figure out what makes your business unique. Now, once you figure out what makes your business unique, you should be able to explain that to an investor in 30 seconds. Now, how do you figure out what makes your business unique? Well, you should already know, but if not, what you're looking at is you're looking at what your business offers that solves a problem for your customers in a way that competitors aren't solving, or in a way that you solve better than your competitors. So at the end of the day, figure out what you offer that offers to the customers, that solves a problem for the customers in a way that's better than your competitors. And please be able to explain that in 30 seconds or less. Okay, not with scientific terms, in a way that different investors can understand. Then once you have what makes your business unique, then you want to have a plan to see what business takes your business unique all the way until what makes your uniqueness into a successful, sustainable company. Now, a lot of you have different goals. Some might be able to create a unicorn, $1 billion company. Some might be 10 million in revenue in 5 years, 100 million in revenue in 5 years, or it might be a different metric. But you need a plan to kind of put that in place. And then the third part is you're going to have systems and processes that help you get from where you are today along some milestones to achieve your plan. Now, after we talk about before the pitch, we're going to talk about during the pitch. I have a pitch deck that I'm going to share with you. It's a sample one. We'll walk through some elements of a pitch deck to pitch investors that'll be applicable regardless of the stage you're in. Then we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts in private equity. One main message I want you to leave here with is that the work starts once you actually get the investment, right? So I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that spend so much time getting the investment and they feel like, okay, now I have that money. But the idea is actually to find an investor that will be a partner that will help you not only give you capital, but expertise to help you achieve the goals in your plan. Okay, so we'll go through some do's and don'ts of private equity when you get the investment. And finally, we'll have some negotiation tips. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to run through some slides. And on the way through, if you have any questions whatsoever, please let me know. Now, before I make this full screen, just something I want to point out with slide creation. You probably already know this, but as you can see, I have these numbers over here. These are the colors of Mink Learning, the company that's my company. But at the end of the day, you'll have your own company and you should have your own colors. And you want to make sure that whenever you do a pitch or any corporate document, that you're always using the same corporate colors. Your marketing people probably already told you this, but just in case, you want to make sure you have the exact green and the exact yellow and that you consistently use this across the board. Okay, so give me 1 second. I'm just going to make this into a full screen. And so let's walk through a few things. So I told you we're going to talk about how to pitch investors, the do's and don'ts of private equity, negotiation tips. We'll conclude it and we'll have some Q&A. But like I said, please feel free to ask me any questions you have whatsoever. Okay, so talked about this. So we have before the pitch and during the pitch. So let's reinforce the idea of what truly makes your business unique. Okay, so usually when we talk to entrepreneurs, the challenge is as an entrepreneur, you want to tell the investor everything about your business, right? And the idea that the thing that you need to really take into consideration is how to actually have your message in a concise way that is truly the catalyst of what makes you different. Okay, and what makes you different, you need to figure out certain criteria that makes you different than your competitors, and you need to emphasize what this criteria is in a 30-second pitch that really shows what makes you unique. Then, as I mentioned, you want to have a plan, and having a plan, doing it out, there's so many different ways to do this, right? There's a business plan, but a business plan realistically takes a lot of time. Okay, so there's a lot of simple ways to kind of map out your plan. Some of you may have heard of a business model canvas, a lean canvas. Some of you have stuff on a napkin. Some of you have stuff on a piece of paper. But what's really important is that you need to have a plan that takes into account various scenarios so that when you are actually pitching an investor, you've already thought of various scenarios, right? So there's different scenarios that can happen in the economy. There's different scenarios that can happen with your research. There could be different scenarios what happens if you get key customers or not. And so my recommendation is even though it's a pain to plan, you take the time in advance to actually write out these scenarios. And so when you're pitching the investor, and the investor will ask you about what happens if this happens, or what happens if that happens, you've already thought of it, and you already have some answers in place so that you can concisely answer the investor's question and move on to other parts about your business. And then the last thing I want to mention, which I've already mentioned, is your systems and processes that you actually have in place. Okay, so along your plan, you're going to have various milestones. And when you have your various milestones, you want to figure out how you're going to get to the milestones. Now, there's a lot of different companies have different ways of actually monitoring their key performance indicators, a lot of different ways of monitoring the goals they have and the milestones they have and how they achieve them. So there's different ways to do that. We won't get into detail on the systems, like the project management systems that you can use. We won't get into details of actually how to set KPIs, just because we're on a webinar and we don't have that much time. But if you have any questions about it, please feel free to ask it in the chat, and I'll either answer it as you ask it or at the end when we have the time for the Q&A. Okay, so now we have the how to pitch investors, and there's a few key rules I'll have before we go through our pitch deck. Okay, so 3 key rules that I think you'd have to have whenever you do a pitch. Okay, the first one is be concise. Now you'll notice there's going to be repetition in my presentation, and the idea of repetition is that I'm actually focusing on what I think are the most important things. And so that when you leave at 1 o'clock and someone comes to you and says, oh, we had this webinar with this guy, Steve, and they say, what did you learn? That you're going to remember the key points. If I just throw an hour's worth of information at you and I have lots of text on my slides, you'll probably remember very little of it. So I'm just focusing on very key points. I'll be repeating them throughout and would love to make sure that you remember this after 1 o'clock. So please be concise. This is one of the biggest problems when an investor pitches an investor, when an entrepreneur pitches an investor, right? You want to say your life story, which is great. You want to say all the background of your business. But at the end of the day, if you can right up front explain what makes your business unique, why it solves a customer's problem, and how it's different than competitors, that would be fantastic. Get straight to the point, very important. And finally, make it understandable. So a lot of times, especially in the agri-food industry, there's a lot of detailed science behind what makes your business better than others. That being said, if you're looking for investors that don't understand that science, take that out of your initial pitch. Now, many different investors around the world that want to invest in agri-food that don't have the experience will eventually, when they're doing due diligence, have someone that can speak your scientific language through the due diligence phase. But right at the beginning, you should have a pitch that all investors can understand. Now, most investors won't invest in something they don't understand. And so as it gets to more detail, then they will have someone sit down with you and do all of the due diligence that's required. But please, 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 in your 30-second pitch, which you should have done 100 times, your employee should know how to do it, your partner should know how to do it. In your 30-second pitch, just make it super clear of what you offer, why it solves a customer's problem better than its competitors, and really what the differentiation is. Okay, so let's go through a pitch deck. So give me 1 second. I'm going to go a sample pitch deck, which I'm gonna throw out here. So this is a sample pitch deck that has many different points alongside it. And so I'm going to walk through each point and I'm going to make some comments. Like I said, please feel free to ask any questions whatsoever. Okay, so the order of a pitch deck is not always standard. I'm going to give you a sample order, but something like the ask. So let's say you're asking investors for a certain amount of capital. Okay, so if you're asking investors for a certain amount of capital, sometimes you might want it on the first slide. Sometimes you might want it on the last slide. Now, in my opinion, you should have a strategy on how you can informally meet investors or through connections, have your connections informally meet investors so that when you're pitching to investors, they have already heard a little bit of your story before you pitch to them. In my opinion, if the investor is seeing your pitch for the first time when you sit in front of them, the probability of getting an investment is a lot lower than if you reach them through informal channels. And the way you can reach them through informal channels is in different ways, which we'll go through actually in our detailed bootcamp that we do in Saskatchewan. But really, really, it could be through connections that pass along your message, or if you get in front of them somehow, you can actually say that 30-second pitch to them. So they actually have an idea of what makes you special, and then they want you to come in so that you can go into more detail with them before they figure out if they want to go to the due diligence phase. Okay, so let's go through this deck. So here, this is an example of a problem slide. Now, as you can see on the bottom, I have something called a progress bar. Now, there's probably too many things on this progress bar for now. You probably noticed in the other presentation that I was showing you, we had 5 points. Remember how to pitch investors, do's and don'ts of private equity, negotiation tips. Here we have a lot more, but I wanted to include a lot of various slides that you could put in your pitch deck to give you that offer. Now, notice how, instead of doing a table of content with, 9 items, instead, I have this progress bar so you can follow along. I think that's easier from a slide perspective. And like I said, you can start with the problem, you can start with the ask, or you can start with something else. Now, you want to make sure that you don't have too much on your slides. My recommendation is that when it comes to the detail of the problem, you can have appendix slides, so appendices to your pitch deck, or other documents that go into more detail. But investors don't have time, right? The average investor that is looking to invest in a company like yours gets pitches all the time. And so what they're going to do is they're going to open the deck and they're just going to kind of quickly scroll through it. And so if you have too much on your slides, the investor is going to get nothing out of it. So my recommendation is make it easy. Understand that the investors are scrolling through it. Okay, they're scrolling through it, and you want to make sure that your key points are going to resonate with the investors when they're going through your slides. So here's an example of the problem with PowerPoint slides. It's time-consuming, tedious, and tasteless. So what is the problem that you are solving for your customers, right? And you want to kind of define the problem clearly. Now, you want to define the problem in a way that in your next slide, when you have your solution, shows that you're clearly solving the problem. Okay, so just make sure you spend a lot of time. You probably have already done this depending on your stage, that you clearly define your problem. Next is your solution slide, right? So these are the main points that the investor is going to understand about your solution. Okay, again, you don't want to write too much about your solution, right? As you'll notice on the bottom, I have the next slide on a product, which goes into a little more detail of how you're going to solve them in more detail, because you're going to use a product to solve the solution in this case. But at the end of the day, when you have a problem, you want to say right away how you're going to solve it. And we'll get to my favorite slide, which shows how you actually solve it better than competitors in a second. So you have your problem slide, your solution slide that is clear, concise, easy to understand, that if the test is, if an investor flips through it and looks at it for 5 to 10 seconds, they're going to remember it. Right? If you looked at this slide in 5 to 10 seconds, you know the 3 ways that we're going to have a solution. We go back to the problem slide. If you go back to the, the 3 main issues that are with the problem, right? It's time-consuming, tedious, and tasteless. So make sure that you emphasize the main points, so if an investor is scrolling through it fast, they get through it. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide. This is a product slide, which goes into a little more detail of the exact product, right? And so in your product, you want to kind of show in a visual way something that the investors can fully understand what your product is. So as you can see, in this example, you have a website that brings designers and customers together, okay? Which should be pretty clear with the title at the top. And then you have some other points that actually show how the product is different, right? And then as you can see, there's a picture on the side. You might want a picture of your product. You basically want people to understand your product. And again, they're spending, when they're scrolling, 5 to 10 seconds. They might not tell you that, but most investors, that's how much they're sending it to you. They're going through this slide if they send it to you. Now, at the end of the day, I would argue the best pitches are the ones that get interrupted, right? So they've gone through your deck, they get an idea of a high level, and then right away, they say, actually, instead of you pitching, the investor says, I have 30 minutes with you, I have 40 minutes with you. Let's get straight to questions. So to me, those are the best pitches, because if you can get to the point where your message can be conveyed before or in a quick way, and that the investor is going into the details, that's where you shine. If you truly have a unique business that solves a problem for your customers in a better way than competitors can, then you just want the opportunity to get into as much detail in front of the investor. Now, you want them to actually ask you questions, because then that shows the detail that they're looking for. So you want to give the investors the opportunity to ask those questions. And to give your investor that opportunity, you need to set all the basic stuff, problem you're solving, solution, product, and more up front so that they can get into the details with you. Okay, so let's move on to the next part, which is the market. I really don't like this type of slide that actually goes on a total addressable market, and then it talks about a market penetration rate. This is very common in the industry. Many startups do it, and most of the investors that I work with, or me as an investor personally, don't really love this slide. And the reason you don't love this slide is because what entrepreneurs try to do is get the biggest type of market possible, right? It's the China argument where you say, oh, there's 1 billion people. All I need is 1% of 1 billion people, and then I have a lot of revenue, right? But really, maybe you can say what the total addressable market is, but a slide like this that says, oh, it's, the market is billions and billions, and we just want a small percentage of it, it's okay. But I love to have lots of follow-on questions to figure out what the market you have now is, what your plan is to actually go to other markets, and how you truly will actually get to the penetration rate. The market slide that I love the best, this is my favorite slide when an entrepreneur has it, is the competition slide. So let me spend some time on this slide because it's my favorite slide. Most entrepreneurs will have a good 30-second pitch on what makes them unique, solving a problem a customer has in a better way than their competitors. And so once you have that 30 seconds, the next question obviously is, okay, well, how do you actually solve that problem, which is then goes into your solution and your product? And then how is it different than your competitors? And so a matrix like this shows 3 key criteria. In the case I'm giving you here is price point, customization, and customer satisfaction. But for your business, there are probably 3 main things, or around that number, that you can do better than your competitors. Now, please don't say you don't have competitors. At the end of the day, there might be a substitute product that's not a direct competitor to you, but most likely there is some sort of competitor. And so you have here on the competition list, you'll see you have your company, then underneath you have 3 different companies. And what you're really trying to do is you're trying to save the investor time. I've been through too many pitches where it feels like this game where the entrepreneur is trying to tell you as the investor what exactly you're supposed to hear. And then you don't trust it, which hurts the relationship long-term if you end up investing. And because you don't trust it, you have to do your own research. And because you do your own research, you end up finding things that are contradictory than what the entrepreneur says. And then you just basically write off the entrepreneur as someone you can't trust. And so if you can upfront to the investor, show them what the market is like and what really is your differentiation, and you can break it up into criteria, this is not only going to help the investor save time on their research on who the main competitors are in the market, but also will reinforce what truly makes you special. And so I'd highly, highly recommend, whether you put this in a pitch deck or it's a talking point when you're presenting, is you have a clear idea of what your top 3, at least top 3 competitors are doing, and figure out exactly why you're solving the problem better than your customers, right? And please don't dismiss your competitors, right? A lot of times, the quick answer is, oh, they just don't do this well, or oh, they're just not good, or their product's not great, or whatever, right? At the end of the day, if you can actually show that your competitors have a sustainable business that they've been building, but yours is going to be different because of this, that would be great. Now, sometimes you might not have a competitor that's really good. That being said, a lot of times I find that entrepreneurs will discount their competitors. And I think the other approach of not discounting your competitors, but showing why you're doing it differently based on key set criteria will help you. Now, just from a visual perspective here, I don't know if anybody's heard of these, but these balls are called Harvey balls. They're very common in like consulting presentations. So companies like McKinsey, Bain, BCG will use these what they're called Harvey balls, which are these circles that you can fill as good or bad. You don't have to use Harvey balls, but at the end of the day, my opinion is you want to create a visual representation that investors can look at in less than 10 seconds, so 5 to 10 seconds, that they can know what you're saying. Okay, so if you looked at this for 5 seconds, right, what do you notice? Right, you notice that our company is best when it comes to price point and customer satisfaction, right? And customization is good. and it's as good as the best company, which is company Z, right? And then you can kind of look down at seeing the competitors. Now, I would argue, this makes our company look a lot better than its competitors, but this gives the investor enough to see that they can ask follow-on questions. So you can say, what is it about your price point that is better? What are the other companies' price points, right? Customer satisfaction. How do you actually measure that? And how can you confidently say that your customer satisfaction is better than the company's? Another thing when it comes to competition is if you're saying your customer satisfaction is better than your competition, you need to make sure that the sample size is representative of the entire population. It's great if you have a couple testimonials, and then we're going to go over some testimonials in the deck a little later. But at the end of the day, you're trying to show that on average, customers are more satisfied with your product than they are with competitors. And you want the investor to actually believe that that's extrapolated to the entire market that wants your product. Okay, so it's about going to that extra level of detail to prove this. But in your pitch deck, don't worry about too much detail. You want to have the backup, but you want to make it so that an investor in 5 to 10 seconds can really understand it. And if you want to if you're sending the slide for detailed review or the slide deck for detailed review before, you want to have appendix slides that go into all the detail. So you can maybe explain up front that, okay, we're going to have a competition matrix that shows you where we stand. And then we have multiple appendix slides explaining each of the criteria and what makes us different. Okay, so that gets you to the market, the 2 market slides. Now we're going to move over to the team. Okay, so I'd recommend you actually have pictures of your team here. Depending on how big your team is, maybe put your entire team or whatever. But really what you're trying to do is highlight what makes you different as a team, right? Just keep in mind that investors see pitches like this all the time, right? You're not the only pitch. Now, not only that, you might think of yourself as, okay, I'm in the agri-food industry, so I'm competing with other agri-food industries. But if you actually think about how an investor thinks, okay, so an investor has an entire portfolio that they've created with a certain risk and return objective that they have set, right? So venture capital or private equity is a small part of the investor's entire portfolio, okay? And so investor might be looking to invest in startups from different industries. They might be investing in late-stage companies that are private in different industries. So your competitor for the investor's money is not just a competitor that solves the problem that you're solving and you solve it better than them. Your true competitor is anybody else that is trying to have a similar risk-adjusted return from your investment in the investor's portfolio. So the investor might look across different industries and say, this might be similar to agri-food. That's your competitor too. And so what you're trying to show is you're trying to show that your team has a competitive advantage in your field. Okay, so here in this example, we have CEO of 3 Silicon Valley startups in the middle, right? For you, maybe it's research you've done at University of Saskatchewan. Maybe it's your experience that you have before you started your company or whatever, right? But you want to kind of make sure that you have something and try to make it a little different. So for example, the 10 years of experience in corporate finance, that's nice. It shows that there's a diverse team here, which is great. It shows that you have someone in corporate finance there. But I wonder if you can beef this up a little more. Okay, let's go to the next the next slide, the traction slide. Now, if you have a lot of traction, this is a fantastic slide for you. You want to show what your business has done so far. Okay, so especially if there are any wins you just had. So let's say you're a Saskatchewan company that sells berries and you just got a big contract to distribute to 120 stores in Taiwan. You might want to put that in your deck here because that's a big milestone that you've hit. And then you might want to keep some other things on milestones that really show your traction so that the investors fully appreciate where you've gone so far. Now, if you're pre-revenue, you might want to focus on a few other things. So as you can see here, we have most downloaded application. I'll give you another traction slide over here. So it's not just about what you've done so far. It's what customers are saying about you. You probably want to get, some ambassadors for your product as early as you can. And if you, let's say, are pre-revenue, you probably want to find other partners you're working with. If you've been around for a long time and you're a really big business, you probably have lots of customers that say lots of fantastic things of working with your business. So I would recommend social proof is really helpful, but also make sure, in my opinion, that the people that are providing testimonials are more than happy to go to the next level with the testimonial. Okay, so find people that would be willing to actually get on the phone with an investor and talk to them. Okay, so I think that's very important. Okay, so let's go on to the business model. This is a little busy for slides as far as I'm concerned, but at the end of the day, the investor's going to want to know how you're going to make money. In this case, you get a fee on top of every transaction, plus there's subscription payments. And so you might want to go through the business model. The investor will be interested in this. Now, next I have this slide for marketing and sales plan. Now, I don't think for every business, this should be in the pitch deck. In my opinion, you now, remember from the beginning, you have a unique business that solves a customer's problems in a better way than your competitors. You have a plan to get there and you have systems and processes in place to achieve the goals of that plan. And so in your plan, you're going to have all different things. Maybe you're trying to distribute to other countries. Okay, maybe you're trying to add a new product mix. Whatever your main value driver is and your main plan to achieve that value driver, in my opinion, that should be a slide in your pitch deck. Okay, so in this case, it happens to be marketing and sales, but in your case, it should be company specific. Now, when it comes to financials, which I'm going to go to next, as you can see, in this case, you have a graph for the next 12 months by product from Q1 to Q4. Sometimes you might want to do 5 years revenue. Sometimes you might want to do something else, right? What you're trying to really figure out is what are the most important financials and how do you visually represent those financials on a screen? Again, my point on the pitch deck, 5 to 10 seconds, the investor sees it. They know what you're talking about. As you can see here, it's clear that revenue is going to be increasing from Q1 to Q4. It looks like product Z is going to be doing well in Q4. And if you're asking, and if your goal is for the next 12 months, you put this in here. Now, sometimes you'll have a 5-year revenue growth graph. And the most common graph that you see in an entrepreneur's deck is the hockey stick type graph. And you know, the question is, should you put in the hockey stick type graph? You know, you want to be optimistic, but you also want to be trustworthy, right? And so what I think some sophisticated investors will do if they see a hockey stick type graph is they'll say, okay, what's your next milestone? And then they'll say, what's the milestone after that? And then how are you going to get there? And what's the milestone after that? And what's the milestone after that? And they'll work backwards to you saying your revenue is going to be 10 times in 5 years. And so you better be able to work backwards and actually say, okay, what's your next step and the step after and the step after? And you better really say the scenario that actually is going to get you to accomplish this hockey stick, right? And a lot of times I see that entrepreneur presentations usually unravel at this point because investors, you know, will look at the financials and they'll say, just walk me back. Okay, so if you're saying revenue is going to be 10 times, who are going to be the customers? Roughly, you don't have to know exactly. Roughly, who are the customers? What's your product mix going to be? How are you going to get there? Right? And so it's usually like just trying to be realistic and actually having a scenario where you get there, but having other scenarios so investors truly understand the risk. And then here I have the conclusion as the ask on how much you're actually asking for. Like I said earlier, sometimes you want to put the ask on the first slide. My advice is that during this pitch, your investor should be trying to understand the details of the pitch because they already know your ask. And what you really want to do, in my opinion, is informally get to the investor before this pitch or have a message sent to the investor so they fully understand the basics of your company. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I see some questions, so I'm just going to quickly hop on to after the example, and then I'm going to see a question. Sorry, I'm gonna my first question I guess we have here is make your pitch deck clear, concise, and easy to remember. I agree with that. Don't be too quick to overlook your competitors. I see that point. That's great. And then I see a question, what specific criteria do you prioritize when evaluating a potential investment opportunity? Okay, so to answer that question, what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer. I'm just going to share, stop sharing my screen for 1 second so you guys can see me. Okay, so what specific criteria do you prioritize when evaluating a potential investment opportunity? What we're really trying to figure out as an investor is we're really trying to figure out that first part. We're trying to figure out, you know, really the product. We're trying to figure out whatever you're offering. Is it truly unique? Is there truly a market for it? The customers truly want it, and is it different than competitors? So that's what we're doing there. And then what we're also trying to do, which I didn't go into too much detail here, but is always the case, we're trying to figure out if we believe that the entrepreneur can actually execute this plan. Okay, so there's two parts to every investment. There's the offering, the product or service, and how it solves a problem and actually fits into the market, and is there a market for it? So you want to figure that out. But then there's also the other part, which is very important, is this team the right team to execute on the plan to achieve this differentiation? Okay, so that answers the question there. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Unless anybody has any other questions. Before I share my screen, feel free to put anything on the pitch deck. I have about 10, 15 minutes left for do's and don'ts of private equity and some negotiation tips. But if you have any questions about the pitch deck, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll just talk like this for another 30 seconds to buy time, just in case we have any questions that I should be answering. Okay, so I see a question says, how does pitching to venture capitalists differ from pitching to angel investors or crowdfunding platforms? Great question. So crowdfunding platforms, okay, maybe you're offering a bonus. So crowdfunding partners are basically, you come in and then there's different people that come in through the crowd, basically, to give you an investment. Usually it's a small ticket, and there's a lot of people at small tickets. And usually there's different things that you can actually give people to be crowdfunding investors. Some might get product or other types of rewards. So that's crowdfunding, right? Where angel investors, a lot of times, are individuals that want to invest. Most of the time, your angel investors are going to have a certain motivation on why they're talking to you. Maybe they want to invest in companies in Saskatchewan because they did well in Saskatchewan and they want to give back to Saskatchewan. Maybe they're interested in being involved on a board of an agri-food company and they have an emotional connection for that. And so when you're pitching to angel investors, there might be a little more of that emotional aspect in your pitch. And your job, which I'm going to get to in your negotiation, your job is to try to figure out what is the emotional connection and why that angel wants to go with you, right? When it's a venture capital, it's going to be a little less emotion and a little more objective, right? So venture capitalists are going to kind of dive deep into some of the things I talked about, which is basically your true competitive advantage, what you're offering, the actual problem, and we'll do a lot of detailed due diligence to see, are they going to get the money back to their investors? Because at the end of the day, the way a venture capital firm works is a venture capital firm raises money from investors, they deploy the money into many different startups, and then they exit the startups to give money back to their investors. And a venture capitalist is compensated on the return they get in that fund. And so their motivations are usually different than angel investors. Some angel investors are fully return focused and similar to venture capitalists, but sometimes you get a little bit of that emotional aspect. So Nafisa, thanks so much for asking that question. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, because I don't see any other questions, I'm just going to go a little bit on the do's and don'ts of private equity. And then on negotiation tips. I won't spend that long because I want to make sure that you all have time for questions. So let me just quickly put this back on a full screen. Okay, so we did the example. Now, by the way, we're going to go to do's and don'ts of private equity. You see on the bottom, like I was talking about, you have the progress bar. And you see how we highlight this part of the progress bar as we go. Just something that I always like to do. You can do it or not, but I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, so what are do's about and don'ts about private equity? Okay, so let's talk about this idea of build trust. So you can say the words build trust, but how do you actually do that? And so I'll tell you some challenges that, we've had investing in companies and something that the companies have done, and maybe hopefully this helps for when you get your investors. Okay, so when entrepreneurs are reporting to investors, there's a few different types of relationships. Okay, so there's the investor and the entrepreneur, which is kind of like a partnership. And that partnership is when the entrepreneur, let's say they have a problem. Let's say the entrepreneur is thinking that they might lose one of their biggest customers. Before they lose the biggest customers, they have a good enough relationship with that investor or representative from that investor that the entrepreneur is actually brainstorming with the investor on how they're going to keep the customer. Okay, so if you have a strategic partnership with that investor, the investor is actually proactively solving problems with you. Now, you don't want all of your investors to be strategic partners because there might be some, you don't need too many cooks in the kitchen, as they say, but you'll have hopefully this relationship with some of your investors and they'll help you navigate some of these challenges because at the end of the day, most investors if they're investing with you, it's probably not their first investment. They've probably seen a lot of this before and they can help you. Now, when it comes to actually reporting to investors, what ends up happening is you have, three different types of entrepreneurs. You have the ones that say all the news that as they happen, and they do clear, concise reporting to their investors. But then there's two other things that happen. There's the entrepreneur that does their best to hide bad news. So let's say you're about to lose a big customer, but technically you haven't lost it yet. In all of your projections and all of your communication as you update investors, you don't tell the investor. And so you hide bad news. And the problem with hiding bad news is that eventually it'll come out and investors all talk to each other. And so at the end of the day, it's going to hurt you on your next round of funding. And so in my opinion, you don't hide bad news. But then there's that third entrepreneur that is doing very well. And so what a lot of entrepreneurs do that are doing very well do with their investors is they do something called sandbagging. They don't want to say all of the good news to the investor, because if they say all the good news to the investor, eventually there will be bad news. And they feel that if they don't tell all the good news to the investor, that when things go bad, they can actually use some of the extra credit from the previous quarter or the previous term to the next term. And I'd recommend not doing that, because at the end of the day, the investor is going to realize what's going on and the investor is not going to trust you. Your goal, in my opinion, is to have a trustworthy relationship with investors, so that when you're looking for more money, and hopefully you're growing enough that you're continually raising capital, or actually, hopefully you're making enough internal capital you don't need to, but let's say you're growing enough that you need external capital, that your investors are willing to help you raise and put more money in. Okay, so a couple other do's for private equity I want to get through. One is clear and concise regular reporting. Now, you'll have to use your judgment with how you do this with various investors. Usually you'll have every 3 months you'll report with them, but it depends on the investor. So last week, I'm in Toronto. So last week I was with a family office, and that family office only has a few investments. So they have 4 investments. Each of the companies has over 50 million in revenue, and those investors have people within their team that are operating partners that talk to each of those 4 companies once a week to help them. Okay, so they sit on the board and they help that company every week, and they proactively help solve problems because they're an investor in a big company. And so that's maybe an extreme example. I don't know if you want to talk to an investor every week, but it depends. So it is possible. Okay, so let's go to another thing that you should do, in my opinion. Okay, so the idea of treating investors' money like it's your own money, to me, there are, a lot of entrepreneurs that once you get the money from the investor might treat the money differently than if it's your own money, right? It's the idea of mental accounting, right? That you have house money versus your own money, right? But at the end of the day, if you are treating the investor's money like it is your own money, then what's going to happen is the investor is going to remember that. The investor is also going to probably give you more money if you need it, and probably has a network where you're going to get more investors. Right? And it's tempting. I know it's tempting if you raise a lot of capital when you have a lot of plans, and then you spend a little more than you were thinking, like it's not your money. Okay. In my opinion, once you have that capital and you have the different things that you're going to invest in, let's say hire a sales team or get a new office or whatever, collaboratively decide with the investor where you're going to go. Okay. So those are some of the do's. Let's go to some of the don'ts. Okay. Some of the don'ts of private equity. Don't hide bad news. We've already talked about this. The next one is don't set unrealistic goals. The amount of hockey stick graphs that I've seen in presentations just is endless. And if you get the hockey stick graph as an investor, you start asking questions that entrepreneurs are going to have to answer and say, what is the probability that you think you're going to achieve this? Then we're going to also ask questions such as, okay, break it down into milestones, break it down into scenarios, and then going through there. So if you set very high goals. Now, don't not be optimistic. It's your business. You want to be optimistic. That being said, if you say there's 100% probability that you're going to be $1 billion company, that may lose trust with the investor. So I'd recommend not doing that. And then the final part is on the other side. Just because someone's giving you money doesn't mean they're a good fit for you. We had an investment readiness bootcamp, as Amy mentioned, in Saskatchewan last year. And a very well-known company in Saskatchewan shared the story where they've got multiple rounds of funding. And one of the early rounds of funding, they had an investor that was such a pain. Okay, so just because I understand you want to raise money, But just because the investor is willing to give you money doesn't mean that that investor is a good fit for you. So please, please, even if an investor is going to give you money, please don't just accept it. Make sure it's a good fit. And in my opinion, you should be doing your due diligence on all the investors before you meet them. In my opinion, what you should do is figure out what companies the investor has invested in before, try to get a hold of those companies to see how their experience is with the investor, and try to actually figure out how to talk to people that can talk to you a little more about the investor. Okay, because what you don't want to do is you don't want an investor that doesn't have your best interests in heart, an investor that's going to want to get too much in the details if you don't want that, right? It could really, really be a big pain for you. Okay, so let's go over some negotiation tips. I see we're around 12:45, so I'll try to go through these fairly quickly because I want to make sure you have time for questions. So negotiation tips, in my opinion, there are lots of fantastic negotiation resources that you could read. You know, there's the classic book called Getting to Yes. There's a bunch of different experts that come out with negotiation plans. So you probably know about a guy named Chris Voss, who's a former hostage negotiator that came out with a book called Never Split the Difference. There's a professor at Harvard that came out with a book called Negotiations. There are tons of materials with different perspectives. So I'm going to share with you my perspective from the investor and the entrepreneur's perspective, but you know, this is just my perspective. So 5 things I'd love you to remember. 1 is to prepare. And when I say prepare, just like the investor should be looking through your concise deck before the investor meets you, you should know as much as possible about the investor before you pitch. Even better, find another company that has pitched to the investor and try to proactively kind of figure out what the investor is looking for, as well as some of the questions that the investor is going to ask. Okay, so as much as you should already prepare for the terms in whatever type of contract you're negotiating. So if you're negotiating a SAFE, you're negotiating a term sheet, you're negotiating a purchase and sale agreement, you should know the various terms in those agreements. And by the way, in our investment readiness bootcamp that we're doing in December, we actually have a simulated negotiation where the venture capitalist and the entrepreneur actually negotiate terms in a term sheet. Okay, but your goal is to prepare before your negotiation. Next, always put yourself in the other person's shoes. As I mentioned when I was answering the question about angel investors, investors sometimes have emotional reasons for wanting to invest with you. Sometimes investors might not just look at getting the best valuation. In fact, quite a lot of times, investors have different wants when they're negotiating with you. So my recommendation is that you put yourself in their shoes, do as much research as you can, and ask tons of questions. Your job, in my opinion, in a negotiation is to be the one that's talking the least. So you want to ask lots of open-ended questions, getting the investor to talk. You're going to want to listen to the investor, and then you're going to want to target mutually beneficial solutions with you and the investor. I see a hand up, so I'm just going to quickly conclude so I can just answer some questions. So again, we went over today on how to prepare for a pitch, right? Make sure that you can clearly explain what makes you unique, that you're solving a problem a customer has in a better way than your competitors. Then we went through a pitch deck. Then we went some do's and don'ts about the relationship with your investor. Make sure that investor is your partner. And then finally, we went through some negotiation tips. That's the end of my presentation for now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I do see a few questions and I want to make sure I answer them. But maybe before I do, Amy, what in your opinion, what's the best use of the rest of our time? How do I prioritize the questions? What do you think?
Well, I see we have one question in the chat from Nafisa. And then otherwise, I think, well, maybe while you're addressing that question, our audience can think about any questions that they might have. Feel free to just turn your camera on and ask away. And maybe Steve, you can address this question from Nafisa, asking about what specific information about the potential investors should the entrepreneurs research before the pitch?
Okay, so let's work backwards and saying, okay, well, what is the goal of the pitch? Now, is the goal of the pitch to raise money from the investor in that meeting? Is the goal of the pitch to make sure the investor truly understands your business? And is there going to be another meeting on how to get the money? So you're trying to figure out what the goal of the pitch is. Then what you really want to do is you want to try to proactively figure out how this meeting is going to go. think of it, right? If you ever went for an interview at a company, your goal is to find someone else who's interviewed at that company, figure out the questions, figure out the style of the interview so that you can better succeed in the interview. And so it's the same kind of thing, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out the uncertainty that could happen in the pitch. And so that's the type of information you're trying to get. Other like things that are I think you're probably already going to do already is you want to figure out how much the investor has. Does the investor have enough money to give you, right? If you have an investor that doesn't have the money that can actually that doesn't have enough money to give you, then that's a thing too. And then another point also is the expertise of the investor. Are you looking for a strategic investor in the agri-food industry, but then this investor has no experience in the agri-food industry? So you want to figure out if the investor is a good fit for you, but then how the meeting is going to go.
Well, that leads really well into the next question we have here in the chat from David, just asking you, can you characterize the size of investments that family firms are currently doing typically?
So I'm guessing, David, you're referring to family offices. I think that, so family offices, when I mention it, are families that have basically their entire investment, all their investment team is within the family, right? So you have your single family offices that a family has the entire team within the family. You have a multi-family office that is basically a company that helps families invest. And then you have a wealth manager that manages families' wealth. So I'm mostly talking about single family offices. And to be a single family office, you need at least a few $100 million in net worth, a lot of times between like over 1 billion, 1 to 5 billion. And so you're looking at usually fairly large investments, right? And this is just the families that I deal with, but it could be different depending on different families. That being said, you could have a family that's interested in doing angel investments that might be interested in the agri-food sector that might have checks of 100,000 or 500,000 or something like that. So I think it's hard to say that, you know, overall, this is what a family's doing. I think it depends on the family. And actually, just to add something else. So you also want to have a strategy when it comes to your pitch. So, and what I mean by that is, okay, so you should, when you're doing research, you should figure out who your A investors are, your B investors are, and your C. Now, your C investors are not necessarily the worst investors, but they're the worst fit for what you're looking for. So an A investor might be someone that's been in agri-food, made some money, and vocally said they want to invest in Saskatchewan. Your C investor might be someone, I don't know, from Europe that said, I want to invest in Canada and agri-food seems nice. And then maybe there's something in between. And then once you have your A investors, B investors, and C investors, my recommendation, and there's different arguments on this, my recommendation is actually trying to pitch your C investors first, because that gives you good practice and you get an idea of the questions they're going to ask, and who knows, they might invest. And by the time you get to your A investors, you're refined. And so, Amy, I see we have sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just see Brianna's question. So Brianna, this is recorded, so we will be able to share the recording with you all afterwards. And then that way you can see the slides that Steve went through.
Cool. And then just to kind of push our investment bootcamp again, we have like an entire day where you're going to pitch, and then we're going to ask you questions based on your pitch. And the day before that day, we're going to help you create your pitch deck, or if you already have one, refine your pitch deck, and then we're going to have you pitch and give you lots of feedback. But sorry, Amy, I think we have another question.
Yeah, Tab is asking us regarding researching the investors beforehand. If we're taking a small investment somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 as pre-seed, how careful should we be in terms of what investor we bring in as compared to when we do a series round, an A series round?
So great question, Tyab. What I would say is, I bet there's a way for you to figure out, whether it's at networking events with Ag-West Bio or FEAD or other places, you could probably figure out which investors in your local area, in your market, have been giving checks of 50 to 100,000 by asking around, right? Ask fellow entrepreneurs. You have, I see Amy, Nafisa, Kendra, and Kyle at Ag-West Bio as well, that they kind of have an idea that you can, there's some really good resources in Saskatchewan. And so I think that's kind of your first step. Who are the investors that are actually giving this check size? And I think that would be the first step, right? And so I think at the end of the day, right, like it's a combination of how much time do you have and how many pitches do you want to do. You want as many A investors as you can. But even if you're getting reps pitching an investor that maybe you're too small for, that actually is okay, because I'd imagine your goal is eventually to get bigger, and then you're actually not too small for that investor. And then if you have an opportunity to pitch and make them very impressed with how unique your business model is and how unique your offering is for better than, like, again, solving the customers' problems that your competitors aren't doing, I would recommend that after a pitch like that, even if they say no, keeping in touch, sending updates on how you're doing, right? Giving some milestones, telling the investor, okay, look, I know you only invest, let's say 5 million. I will get to that point. Maybe it might take me 2 years, but I will get to that point. Is it okay if I give you an update every 3 to 6 months? Because my goal is to hit milestones so I get there. They might say, great, maybe meet them for coffee in 6 months to a year, update them on how you're doing. And then that's a lot easier pitch in 2 years than in 2 years reaching out to all cold investors.
Wonderful. Well, maybe last call for any more questions, and then I'll pass it over to Nafisa for some closing remarks. Oh, Betty says, what would be too small for your firm? I'm guessing maybe she meant when you used to work
We'll
in private equity.
we still invest. And so, Betty, why don't we talk offline? I know you mentioned as we were coming in that you're expanding to Korea and Japan. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be in Korea and Japan in August. So why don't we chat offline?
Awesome.
Awesome. I will take it away from you, Amy, here. Thanks again, Steve, for such an insightful presentation. Before I let you guys get going, I just wanted to talk a little bit about FEAD. FEAD is a member-based national nonprofit based out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Our goal at FEAD is to support the growth for founders and leaders in the agri-food industry with accessible and relevant resources, learning, and networking opportunities. This program would not be possible without our funding and founding partners, Food Center and ICED, which is Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. And just a quick reminder for all of you that our next and last session of the Essentials for Business Excellence series will be presented by IP expert Harm Deckers at 10 a.m. on June 13th. This IB Strategies webinar will cover business strategies to develop and manage valuable intellectual property assets, as well as practical how-to guidance. So mark your calendars, and we look forward to seeing all of you then. Thanks so much again, Steve, for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.